There we go. Welcome everybody to the Sunday night call. Tonight, Briley from Team Prodigy. You guys call it Prodigy? You don't say Prodigy, right? You say Prodigy?
Yeah, I think that's the right pronunciation.
Okay, so from Team Prodigy, Briley has volunteered to lead our discussion tonight. We're going to do a week one review and what we learned. So, Briley, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Yeah, I'm from Team 3277. We sat about 30th the entire competition. Kind of went up a little bit, kind of went down a little bit, and then we didn't get picked in finals. But it was a good day, good week. We didn't have any breakdowns, so that was pretty awesome. Just kind of starting off, going right into the kind of checking in the competition. What did you like? What did you like? Getting there and being able to weigh in on check-in day was really nice. I feel like it helped move things forward for when you're getting you inspected on the first day, the practice day. I felt like it kind of just picked up the pace a little bit, and I thought the venue at the Great Lakes Regional was really nice. Our team hasn't been there for like 6 years or so, but I thought it turned out really nice. What is everybody else's thoughts on where they went to their week one at, and how did it go in the check-in day?
I thought the venue was nice as always. The regional planning committee did lovely. I think all of the Minnesota teams would have gone to either Northern Lights or Lake Superior. I don't think any of us are flying out to Vancouver. I thought it was a nice venue, as always, and thinking about some of the events in the Vancouver room from what I saw when I was walking by seemed pretty fun.
Does anybody else have any comments on it?
Having been at a regional out west last year, I love having a practice field and elements. Like, it feels like you can work on your robot, especially week one. That is such a big deal, and we're so lucky to have it.
I thought the practice field was very nice. It was hard fitting, so many teams onto it, trying to find a time slot. But I felt like if you really needed it, you definitely could get in. It wasn't that filled. It was definitely felt like it was just the right amount. It would be much nicer if you had one for each Northern Lights and the Great Lakes, or Lake Superior. But it was definitely nice to have. Moving on, I guess in the next topic, I think we can start just like an overall match strategies. To me, I think there was really only 3 that kind of popped up that I really saw. It was either you're running a triple offense, you're running double offense and 1 defense, or you had a good algae bot and you had 2 other coral scoring offense. My take on it was that triple offense runs really good against triple offense. But once defense kicks in, triple offense can run really bad because 4 bots on the one side just helps out that defense bot and gets really cluttered really fast. And defense is interesting this year. It can be really good or it can be really bad. Thunder saw that in their second match in finals, or their match that kicked them out of it in finals. They had a really bad defense bot that round. What are your guys' take on just overall match strategy on those 3 I talked about, or a different one that maybe you saw?
I guess for me, I think one thing that we saw, at least on Northern Lights, especially with like teams like us and with 111 Wild staying, we were able to both cycle coral and algae at the same time. And so our cycle would be an L4 coral, pick up algae from the reef, place it into the barge, pick up another coral. And so that was our cycle. And so it was a little bit of a mix between algae and coral for us. And so that was an interesting way to sort of be able to get those algae points. And I know like with our playoff match against KnightKrawler, like those algae points were the deciding points in the match. We were really neck and neck in coral. And so then those algae points were really beneficial there.
Yeah, and there weren't very many teams that could do algae. I think that was a pretty big gap. Especially, I mean, LG directly into the barge. Okay, that's pretty hard. But there were a lot of teams that just didn't do LG at all. I don't know if we expected that, if I expected that or not, but it was hard, especially when we were doing alliance selections. We were hoping to get somebody who could do LG, and I thought the students told me there just wasn't anyone left.
Yeah, so what Megahertz did for our strategy was we picked Tonkabots, and Tonkabots said that they were a really good L4 scorer, but they couldn't de-algify. So while they were doing L4, we would do a mix of clearing the algae and scoring into the barge or processor while doing coral for L2 and 3, and obviously that worked very well for us.
What Dominic was talking about, the pulling or placing a coral and scoring an algae in the barge, I heard that called super cycles at some point. I think that's what we're going to see a lot of coming around to champs time. I think that's going to be really big. At least in the Lake Superior side, looking at finals, I didn't see a whole lot of matches that it was like algae was the deciding factor. Usually it was one team was scoring a lot on coral and the other team just didn't score as much. I think the hang was actually a bigger decider for who won. Did you have triple deep hang or did you only have double deep hang? And that was at least what I saw on the Lake Superior side.
See, that's really ironic because on Northern Lights, there were not many teams that could deep hang, a deep climb. You had maybe only one or two on an alliance. I know at least Alliance 4, none of our robots could deep climb. And so, but I heard on Lake Superior, you had like 6 or 7 alliances that all 3 robots could deep climb. And so thinking about whether, for us, it was like, well, none of us can deep climb, so we might as well just keep playing the game we're playing and sort of ignore endgame. But that was an interesting sort of difference between the 2 regionals that I saw.
Yeah, I think it was the final match, like the second finals match up against Upper Creek and us. It was like a 10-point difference, and we all ended up deep climbing. Like all 3 of robots on each side deep climbed, and I think otherwise it would have been a tie if one of the robots couldn't deep climb. They just parked, like if our robots. So I think deep climb became very important for finals as well.
Also on that deep climb, I think it was a real big decider for if you were picked for finals or not. I think the 2 biggest deciders when it came for second pick, I mean, we weren't in the picking position, but just when I was looking at who was picked and who wasn't, I think having a deep hang and if you were able to score or if you had a good auto, I think was kind of what put you in that position to be picked. We didn't have either of that. I think that was our reason why we didn't make it to finals. We had a really good defense showing, but I just think that being really good at defense, but not having that deep hang and not having a good auto was our biggest weakness in not being picked in finals.
Yeah, so when we were deciding on who our Tonkabots and us, when we were deciding on who our third robot should be, we were kind of thinking about like which robot did have a deep climb, and that was the ultimate decider of who our third robot was.
That's interesting because at Northern Lights, at least from the matches I saw, you only had a handful of teams that had more than a 1-piece auto. I mean, I don't remember exactly, but I would say maybe the top 10 teams had a 2 or 3-piece auto. And so you couldn't even consider a good auto when it came to a second pick. I know like our second pick our second pick was Talons and they were only defense. They didn't even have a scoring mechanism on their robot. But like when we weren't even considering auto in our second pick, which is an interesting difference.
I think the top auto we saw in the playoffs was 5, correct? There's a couple of them.
Yeah.
I think total for the Alliance, yeah.
I think Alliances almost 1 through 6, all 3 robots did something in auto with the coral, whether they left and attempted to score it on L1 or they scored it on L4. I think going back and watching the matches, I think it was at least Alliance 1 through 6 that all had something for coral and auto.
I would say 1 through 8. So.
Really, all of them.
Because yeah, we hit 5.
So we talked about. Did anybody see a shallow climb? I don't think we had one on Lake Superior side.
I think we had one or two.
Yeah,
Okay.
we had at least one shallow climb I remember seeing. There might have been others.
I was gonna say I haven't really seen much of those because I watched Minnesota's and I was watching Pinnacles in California this morning, and almost every I'm seeing mostly is you ought to have a decline or you parked. That's kind of the pattern I've been seeing. Yeah. And Rembrandt came up with this crazy auto, but one of the things I was seeing with them is and a lot of even from Lake Superior too. Was also I didn't watch much of Northern because I was also at school. Was people were just shooting corals, but then they fall off and they land in the middle there, and so or they try to go for L1 and L2, and it just ended up in the middle there. I'm like, oh boy, that middle is just getting crowded and crowded. But you know, but the thing that made no sense to me was teams are in such a hurry for fast cycle time. But then if your cycle is so fast, but you are not getting it in a pack and keeping it in a pack, what's the point of going so fast? And I saw that even with Thunder also there were a few like that too that I saw, and I'm like, slow down a little bit. I mean, it was exciting to watch Superior. So thank you guys. You put on a really good show.
Speaking of those coral being dropped on the floor, did anybody see many issues with that? Like teams just not being able to get to a feeder station because coral on the floor, or not being able to get to the reef because there were so much coral?
The thing I saw was the algae. A few bots almost tipped this weekend because of algae. There was this one in California, and it was hanging like this, and the defense bot came and accidentally hit it and then corrected it. It's like, oh, thank you, because that robot was gonna go down.
We actually had trouble with that at the beginning of our matches, but I learned how to like scoot them around more, and we had a spinning way, we would spin to knock all the coral out before we parked and stuff. So yeah, we just kind of worked around it in the end.
That's what I saw a lot of too, and that's what we did for our own team, is just kind of press up against it and slide across to move them out of your way. Again, what Jeremiah was talking about too, we saw I think 4 or 5 teams that ended up perched on top of a ball for a match in finals that happened, and they were successfully able to get off. A teammate came and pushed it out from under them. We went to go try to play defensive match, and we got stuck on a ball too. It seems like if you go too fast, you'll go up on top of one. But if you're moving around them slowly, you're less likely to kind of get stuck on top of a ball.
And also, when you have the bumpers higher on your robot, I've seen that can catch it better and get you stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I thought back to the comment that Jeremiah made about coral in the middle. I was because our practice elements, I'm sure you guys are probably the same way too, were made out of plywood. And I was expecting, the polycarb will be slipperier, so the coral will kind of roll around those pipes and fall in the trough, and that is not what happened. I was surprised how many coral got hung up in the middle and didn't work their way down to the bottom. That was unexpected for me.
Speaking of the material on the reef, we were surprised that the base of the reef was not the same as what was in the game manual. The texture on the bottom of the reef was pebbled instead of matte black, and so our sensors didn't work. Fortunately, our odometry did, but yeah, we could not use our time of fields sensors all competition.
Wow, that's crazy. So let's talk more about the reef. I don't know. I posted some information in the mentors Slack for Minnesota coaches, but we created a little plumb bob mechanism that would measure that the top of the reef pole was where it was supposed to be according to the CAD. And on the Northern Lights side, every single pole was off by, that's not true. There were 2 poles that were exactly what they were supposed to be based on the CAD. Most of the poles were 3/4 to 7/8 of an inch tipped forward. And on the blue side, the 2 poles that were next to the driver's station were dead on. There were 0 and maybe an 1/8. They were right where they need to be. On the opposite side of the reef, they were an inch and an 1/8 tipped forward. All the poles were tipped forward. None were tipped back. And they were all 1/8 of an inch short of 6 feet, except for 2 poles I found that were 3/8 of an inch short. So if you're tipped forward 3/4 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch short, if you had a coral score that was coming in at an angle, you had a lot of potential to go over the top. We ended up doing just fine. It didn't seem to affect ours at all, even though we have one of these coral scores that goes at an angle. Also, the poles moved a ton. They moved left to right, 1/2 an inch maybe at the top. So that was not something I expected with the field, but I think we were fortunate that it didn't seem to affect us much.
Yeah, we had to tune some of our paths to make sure that we were actually hitting the coral dead on. If we missed an L4 on one of the reef posts, we said never go to that reef post again that match, because you're never gonna get it.
Did you set yourself up? So your robot, so your camera is looking at the center of the April tag and then adjust in that way, or what did you do?
I think we mostly relied on odometry. Thinking about with those April tags, we were pretty precise with that, and then we were able to sort of tune it throughout the length of the competition so that we always hit on the reef posts. But yeah, because we have a path for each reef post on the 2 alliance sides. And so when we noticed, we missed on that reef post, we watched back our video and said, all right, we missed by half of the coral diameter or so. And so we adjusted that path to be 3 inches over or whatever.
One thing that got us was Blue Side Auto and Superior was the coral station. If you're using vision at all, like the teams that were successful figured out they had to filter out that April tag, but we didn't figure that out. So like Blue Side Autos would score 1 and then just crash in the wall randomly all over the place. I don't know if it was flopping or what, but it did not work, and several teams reported that.
Scott, didn't you say that the April tags were really movable too on the reef base?
I didn't say that, and I don't think they moved on the reef, but they were very wiggly up on the barge. I saw somebody post a video of that someplace. I don't remember seeing any problem with the April tags on the reef, though. Does anyone else remember that?
Maybe it was something I heard from my own mentors.
Reef seemed fine for us. It was the coral station for us, and only one side.
I heard that Thunder shut off their autonomous aiming in teleop because it was not accurate enough. So they went to full manual. And I think there was maybe another team that did that too. So definitely some teams that were having trouble with, maybe it was just their code that was why they shut it off, or it was actually just the field wasn't quite what they were expecting.
We turned off all of our auto alignment for teleop and just manually aligned, and part of that might have been the field. Part of it was that we just didn't get enough time with our programmers before we went to Duluth. I'm optimistic that we'll have better auto alignment for the next event.
Yeah, we didn't have any trouble with our auto alignment using odometry. I mean, I mentioned we had huge troubles with our sensor auto alignment. But yeah, the reef surface April tags were fine for us from what I could tell. But that was because our programmers labored away last summer trying to figure out odometry. So kudos to them.
I would like to go back to defense and pick up on kind of what I was talking about, good and bad. What did you guys see on defense? Did you see a lot of good defense, a lot of bad defense, or somewhere kind of in between? What was your guys' visions on that? Would you see?
At least on the Northern Lights side, I only saw 2 or 3 maybe robots that were like intentionally always playing defense. There were a few teams that like came up to us and were like, "Oh, we can play defense in playoffs," but hadn't actually played it in quals, which I thought was interesting. Thinking about how can, like, because of this fact that the second pick is sort of almost is like intentionally going to be playing defense. Thinking about how can you sort of show that in qualification matches. But there were a fair number of teams that did play defense during quals, but I didn't see a very good defense when that happened.
I thought it was really effective when there were 3 robots that stayed on a side, because wherever there were 2, it was just chaos at that station. But if one left and then returned favor and went to the other side, it slowed you down, but it wasn't game. I didn't see very much that was super effective.
I think
what Briley failed to leave out is that we got play defense on us the very second qualification match number 2. Like, so coming out of the gate, that was something that we were super surprised about, and we handled it fairly well. But I mean, second match of the entire competition, and they're on us like that as much.
Was that versus us?
That was 3100 that played defense on us.
Okay.
And the thing with defense that I've seen with the teams, other regionals do is like, one, there was this one team today that cost their alliance like I think 53 penalty points, and I'm wondering with all the obstructions, because how you show about staying away from the protective zone when they're scoring, because I think that's how they got most of those penalty caught on them, and there were a few times where teams were hitting the other team's cages too, and that's but it's like if you're gonna go play defense, don't incur 50-some point penalty points, because then what's the point? But what I thought would be effective from what I saw, there was one team that did that today. Was you find a robot and just stick to that robot, because there's no way you can say, "Oh, I would block both," core station going back and forth. But just find that strongest robot like does that fastest cycle time, and you just stick to them like fly on whatever. And then you, like Ryan just said, then your 2 people back there, they are not having one can take this core station, the other one can take that core station and cycle. That was the only one time I only saw that was very effective. That was in Pinnacle, California today.
I will say that Talons did an amazing job of defending both loading stations. They'd go to one rolling station, and just as they're about to drop the coral, they'd hit the bot, and the coral would miss the intake of that bot, and then they'd push them around a little bit. They get a coral, and then they'd zip to the other side, and just as they were getting there, they'd hit a bot, the coral would fly out, and have to throw another one in. That happened so many times. Talons did a really good job of playing both corals. The best defense I saw the entire tournament. They did a great job.
Yeah, to comment on that, that was the only team that both our drive coach and I had ever heard of that they had a dedicated defense driver versus an offense driver. They had 2 separate drivers, one for playing defense and one for playing offense, which I thought was a very funny idea.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
But I do think that by and large, defense wasn't very effective for most matches, and I think it just has to do with you do have to cross the field, and a lot of drivers never practiced that or weren't prepared to do that. We had defense played on us a lot of our matches, and I don't know if the bots that were playing against us were lighter than us, or if the Krakens made that much of a difference on the drivetrain with the SDS modules. But we were able to push the robot out of the way most of the time. It was probably Talons that was playing against us that we did have a couple matches, or maybe just one, where we really struggled to get it. Certainly in finals when we played No Mythic and Company, we struggled against Talons. But I think might have been one other calls match, and maybe it was also Talons that did that. But for the most part, defense didn't slow us down all that much. I think so. On the Northern Lights side, I have a question for those that were there. Dominic, maybe you have some thoughts on this, but I overheard our drive team asking questions about what is a pin, because they were seeing people getting called for pin penalties, even though all the robot had to do was back up. So sort of an open field pin where you're preventing them from going where they want to go, but they're not stuck to the wall. They easily could have gotten away. And it sounded like, and again, I'm getting this secondhand, but it sounded like there were pin penalties being called when you actually weren't pinning a robot up against the wall. You were just prohibiting them from going where they wanted to go.
Yeah, from what I heard, the referees changed the pinning rules throughout the competition. That maybe they didn't know it at first, and then by the end of the competition, they realized what they were doing. But what I heard from Talons as well was the fact that pins were reduced to 3 seconds this year, and so you have 3 seconds to pin the robot, and then also to get 6 feet away from that robot. And so you have really just a 1 second pin count if it takes 2 seconds to get away from that robot that is then chasing you, right? Because you're facing them on. If you leave, they're going to keep pushing against you, but you need to get 6 feet away from them within those 3 seconds. And so with the shorter pin rule, that made it really, really difficult to see, as well as the fact that you're playing defense on the far side and it's hard to see that ref on that other side with the barge truss.
That's true. I did remember the 3 seconds, but I did not remember that 6 feet rule. That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, our Talon's drive coach was like counting out the pins for their driver, and they got like 1 or 2 seconds worth of a pin ever. And so they found it much more effective to not even attempt pinning and to rather just hit out of the way, especially for the teams that had a really narrow intake like funnel. Like Wild Sting had a really narrow, where it was just like a little flange on the tube. It was really like, I know at the last match on Friday that we played against Wild Sting, we were supposed to lose that match. We had like a 16% chance of winning that match, but we played defense against Wild Sting. And because they had such a small area of intake from the coral station, they were super easy to knock around and drop their coral.
Was that the one at the end of Saturday?
That was the one on the end of Friday. It was like match 58.
Friday. Yes, we were with you on that one. That was epic. Yeah.
I think there was a lot of good points in there. Like Ryan talked about in the beginning, playing defense on a triple offense. If you're running that triple offense, you need to tell one of your teammates, you got to get out of here. It's just gets too congested. I see Jeremiah's idea of sticking to one robot. We played defense against 876. I think that match, it was to a double offense and a defense and a double offense and a defense. Thunder hadn't scored a match lower than 130. That match, they scored, I think, 89 points that match. So I think we did a successful job at keeping those points low. But you got to tell your teams, I think the best strategy is to stick along the driver's station on the opposite side. I don't see any reason to chase them towards the reef. We had some success with pinning. I feel like on the Lake Superior side, it was a 1, 2, and then you had time to get away to drive towards the other drop zone. And we never got called for that floating pin count. I felt like they were really clear on that. But definitely I saw in a match of finals. I talked about this a little bit earlier. One of Thunder's teammates, they scored 42 points in the first 15 seconds in fouls because they hit them twice in the reef zone and then twice in the barge zone. It was kind of rough to watch.
If you can just mess with doesn't Dominic just if you can just interfere with them taking their coral, that's your biggest impact you can. If you lose them there, don't go towards the reef, because the teams that I saw today incurring penalties, that's how they got it, because it's a lot of things either way to see where your robot actually is versus. I mean, the referees have a better vantage point than you do, and they have the final call. They can do that thing, and there's nothing you can't argue it. You can, but it's not going to make any difference. So, but at least stay away. You can see your robot staying clear of the protected area. So, but yeah.
Who is the robot that was with Thunder? I thought it was interesting because they do a little defense and they kind of muck it all up down there because they're picking up algae. Then they would shoot them from that side. I thought that was kind of a fun strategy. They were a little vulnerable from where they're shooting from. You could go between the reef and them and then tap them for some penalties, even though they weren't trying to play defense there. They were lining up to shoot. But I thought that was clever.
That was Rozo that was doing that.
I think that idea will develop a little bit. Like if you're an algae shooter and you can go down there and pick up an algae and then play some opportunistic defense, and it's a 2v1, but you're still scoring.
I saw that today too. A team going and taking the other team in the algae, then scoring it in the barge, and then or throwing it towards their side of the field. And so, but the other thing I also saw this weekend, I think it's Superior and somewhere else, is that if you cycle algae faster in the processor, as much as that give you 6 points, right? 6 points for that. And there was this one kid, he kept nailing every single one of his 4 points in the barge, and I'm like, do you want to be doing that for a 2-point differential? I don't know. It was just one of those things where I was thinking, is yeah, you're getting those 6 points, but now he's consistently getting his 4 points, and he didn't miss one. I mean, he was a tall kid, so it's not like he literally went like this and just kind of eased it into it, and I'm like, oh, that's a good strategy. You find a tall kid on your team and make them a human player.
I
think the only thing that I want to add here is that Centurions could score in the processor, but the only time they ever scored in the processor was the last 3 seconds of the match. Because they said at that point, all of L4 is going to be filled, so we might as well grab an algae and score those 6 points. The human player is not going to have time to score it into the barge because it's still going through that sensor. And so getting those last 6 points right at the very end of the match.
It might be a way to make up for our lack of deep climb if we can figure out how to do that effective. I mean, I think we got up on the practice field. It wasn't fast enough, but it's an interesting thought because you're far away from parking or climbing, but that's 6 points right there for the taking.
That was a viable strategy. I heard and definitely I saw a few teams that were accomplished it in quals. I don't think I saw much of it in finals, but I did hear of that strategy.
When it comes to processor scoring too, something we tried, so we had to face in the finals on Lake Superior, Lightning Turtles and Upper Creek. That Lightning Turtles just putting, I don't know how many they put up in the net, 10-ish or something.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to score a bunch of algae in the processor just to see if we could get that net really full, if it made them actually start missing or making it harder for their robot to place it in. And it didn't really work. It was an interesting idea, but if rewatching the videos, it didn't really work. The idea being if there's 15 of them up there, maybe their human player starts missing or the robot has to stack them 2 layers high. But I don't think it's going to come into play going forward.
I think I watched one of those matches and then they missed one from the processor in, so that was a score. You gained an extra 4 points from that processor score than usual. But yeah, it's really easy to throw those balls up in the net from the processor. It is. You're expecting 2 points out of it. So it's really only viable if you're going to do it in the last couple of seconds, or you're doing it because L4, 3, and 2 are already filled.
When we were even hoping that it would make it harder for their robot to score them, right? Like if you're barely at the height limit to get it in there, maybe there's some more bouncing, things mess around, you have to go like higher. But I don't know. At least for their design, they had it locked in.
One of the things I'll say about the processor, I mean, I agree. I only saw one kid miss an LG. The human player missed it for the LG, but after the 3 matches, I think it was after 3 matches, our first 3 calls matches, we noticed that we were significantly behind the other teams ahead of us, even though we hadn't lost one yet because of the tiebreaker with the co-op. And so the next match, we went out and scored 4 in the processor, 2 in ours and 2 in theirs. And we got the co-op for the tiebreaker. And then the next match, we went out and scored 2 in ours and 1 in theirs because they had already scored 1. I think we may have done that once before where we were scoring LG in the other alliance's processor because we wanted the tiebreaker. We ended up finishing with a co-op average twice as much as the second and third place team on our side because we wanted that tiebreaker. But of course, if you look at the stats, our Coral scoring was down because for those matches, we were running over the other side of the field and we were doing LG. So it is a trade-off. It worked out for us in terms of the ranking, but it hurt us for alliance selection because there were other teams that looked like better scorers ahead of us. And maybe they were better scorers, but us running across the field to score LG in their processor certainly didn't help.
Ranking points felt brutal for us. Like we were 4-2, 5-2 at one point, and still sitting at 30-something place because like we weren't deep climbing, and we had a 1 not moving auto, and also like we were averaging 2.5 with 4 wins. It was rough.
Yeah, we were surprised how difficult the processor was. There were a couple teams that tried it in practice matches, and I know at least our team, we never got it. And so we sort of scrapped that whole idea of scoring in the processor. I think I only saw a handful of teams on Northern Lights side score in the processor, which was sort of surprising.
I kind of want to talk about what Scott and Ryan were talking about. That new RP, 3 for winning, and then there's 3 extra ones you can get. I definitely think that caused some chaos, and your good teams are not always in your top 10. There were a lot of teams that were high scorers, but they were down there in the 30s because they just couldn't get the RPs. They had bad matchups. I know on Lake Superior, one of our top 8 teams was a Coral bot or an Algae bot, and they were not a good Algae bot. They made it into picking, and they wouldn't have been even a second place pick. I think that was my thoughts on that team. What are you guys thinking of the new RP system?
Yeah, I mean, we thought it was interesting. We specifically sent out pit scouts to all of the teams asking, do you have an auto that can move? And if they didn't, we sent our programmers to go and help them make an auto that moved. And so I think by the end of the competition, there were maybe just like 1 or 2 teams on the Northern Lights side that ended up not moving at all in auto, which was nice for us because then we would always get that auto rank point. But thinking about how to make sure that you get that auto rank point, especially, I mean, we're fortunate that we have enough programmers that we're able to send over a couple and say, all right, you have your programmer, now let's make an auto together, right? But thinking about how do you do that as a smaller team, I don't know exactly. But that was definitely beneficial for us.
Nice greater professionalism there.
Yeah,
We had a push out auto, but it feels bad to ask a team to let you run that.
We tried to do a bump auto, but it was a swerve team, and by default, I think your motor's in brake mode. We didn't push long enough in order to get to even move them. It was just a half-second bump, and then it didn't work. We had written a bump auto specifically for teams that didn't move, so that we could get them lined up bumper to bumper, but it did not work for us. It worked for us in 2020 when we did that because it was the same type of thing of just move anywhere out the line. But back then, most people were tank drive, and it was a little bit easier. Back to the ranking point question, I was just looking, and there was only one match. It was a match that we were in that had a 6 ranking point match on Northern Lights, and it looks like there was 3 matches on Lake Superior that got 6 ranking points. I kind of like the idea that it's a little bit easier to cause separation between teams, where in previous years you'd have so many ties and you go so deep in the tiebreakers. I kind of like that you didn't have to go so deep in the tiebreakers, but it did mean that you had to have an alliance that could do a lot of different things. Or you had to change your gameplay, like I mentioned with the co-op, where you were sacrificing one thing to be able to do another.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Scott. Like, I like the idea, the concept of the 6, where there's lots. It's actually pretty hard to do 6. I got to say, I didn't like the auto one just because it felt really punishing if you had a team who just could not. I know we had one where we tried to send our programmers over, and they had 2 CSAs digging in the bot, digging in the code, and it was just like, and their bot barely makes it on the field in time, and you just lose it there. And it didn't feel like you got the auto one specifically. It didn't feel like you were rewarded for doing well. It's just anytime something out of your control didn't let it happen, you were punished pretty hard. But I thought the other 2 were great. That was awesome.
It does it does force kind of those higher resource teams to build a lot of different functionality, where I think just because we have less people and less mentors, we try to streamline a little bit for playoffs that were relevant. And that's just a trade-off, but I think it's good, because then I feel like you got to playoffs and it wasn't like the matches weren't 180 to 70, right? Like there was some give and take, and you had a shot if certain things went your way and stuff. Like it felt good a little bit that way.
I agree with you, Sam. I don't like scoring systems where you need to have 3 functional robots to get the ranking point. Like Steamworks was really bad, because if all 3 robots couldn't climb, there was no way you were going to get that ranking point. I liked the in-game scoring this year because you could get the ranking point with only 2 functional robots. I think that was great. I think they could have improved the auto ranking point by saying, fine, you only got 2 robots that move off the line, you better put 3 coral up high. If it would have been points based instead of an individual task per robot based, I think that would have been a better way to do it. But I always like it when 2 good, well performing robots can still get the ranking point, even with a robot that just something goes wrong and something crashes or something, and they're toast. We were toast one match. We moved 8 feet off the line, and we moved 8 foot back on the line to park, because we had to take a CAN coder apart and resolder all of our connections. We got lucky and found that if you tapped a CAN coder just right, that all the lights went off on the robot. So luckily we found it. We had 3 matches where we were seeing stuttering and jerking, and we finally figured out it was inside the CAN coder, took it apart, resoldered all the connections, and never had a problem again. But weird things happen. You just never know. It's nice when you can still get those points, even if you have a dead robot.
I got a question from an observer, by the way. This is 2530. It was a lot of fun to watch you guys. Wish we had been a part of it. But from the perspective of going for the Coral RP, it looked like most people weren't really trying hard for it. And certainly, especially from the perspective of not going for a lot of co-op, not even trying to drop that threshold. So what was the feeling, on the field there? Were people just like, hey, let's get all L4 and get those points and not even go for the RP, or were people really even trying?
At least from our perspective, I know it really depended on the match, right? If we looked at the match and said, all right, this is going to be a close one, we would try and focus on L4. But there were a fair number of qualification matches that we were like, all right, I think we can get the coral link point. There was one match where we had enough coral on the reef and we were missing one on L4. And I said to our drive coach, can you please learn to count? But that was, which was very sad to see. Like, we had 6 or 7 on L3 and not enough on L4. And it was like, no. But like, thinking about, like, I think it really depended on how close the match was. But I also know, like, at least for us, we were much more efficient at scoring those L2 and L3 corals. It was actually slower for us to score L4. And so thinking about, can you divide the reef by layer by robot, right? Thinking about, you have one robot score 5 on L4, you have one robot that scores 5 on L3, and such and such. And so like thinking about how do you divide that reef up in your pre-match strategy to make sure that you can get those coral RP.
The other thing from an observer perspective that I saw was a lot of L1s weren't being successfully scored. Things were just, I was just like sitting there, I'm like, come on. I mean, things are just falling off. I mean, people would throw, I wish some of those motor speeds would dial back a little bit, because I felt like they were shooting it fast and then would just bounce off and fall off, and it was just a lot of those.
I think from our team standpoint, there were quite a few matches that we did try to go for that coral RP, but if you don't have a good algae bot to score that co-op for the other side, because they also didn't have an algae bot, then it was honestly really hard to get even 20 coral cycles. And especially like Jeremiah was talking about, if you have two good bots that are good at 4, 3, and 2, most likely they weren't good at 1. So then how do you get that last row filled to get that ranking point? That was something that we were really, exactly like David's saying now. It was hard for a lot of teams to score an L1, and then if they can't get the co-op, how do you get that coral RP?
Dominic, I will share the same frustration, and we all have the same frustration. I think we missed a 6 RP match 2 other times because we were missing 1 on one of the layers. But the L4s were full. We had the opposite problem. We were really fast at L4. It took longer for us to line up for 2s and 3s. And so I agree. I think a lot of times you were like, fill up L4s because we need to get a lead to make sure we can win, and then we'll worry about the coral. And then there just wasn't time. So I wonder if that strategy will change as the season goes on, where people will focus on, let's get 5 on every layer, and then we'll worry about getting enough points to win. We'll fill that L4 to win, or if it'll stay the same of try to get a lead by using L4s and then worry about getting the coral ranking point. It'd be really interesting to see how that changes as the season goes on.
Did you all have matches where you felt like you had a lead enough early? We never felt until the second day, and then the teams didn't really want to rank higher at that point because they. Does that make sense? Like everyone was like, "Yeah, we're just gonna make sure we win this match." And it was 10 to 20 points every match for our first day. It felt like
the 2 matches I mentioned where we went and filled the processor on the other side. We weren't going to do that unless we felt like we had enough of a lead to do that. We weren't going to risk the victory to go try to get the tiebreaker for co-op. Yeah. But it wasn't every match. I mean, it just depended on the matchup. I think we had a friendly schedule. At least we had some matches that were friendly enough that we could go score on the processor on the other side. But we did have a strategy of do L4s until we felt comfortable crossing the field. So we did think about that, but it was about getting yourself enough padding that you could stop scoring for a while.
And we went in a lot with it helps to have a really strong auto for that, just because you can if you come out of auto 30 points ahead, you're like, okay, now you're feeling pretty darn good. And especially if you're scoring 2 or 3, now you only you can basically get L4 done and kind of evaluate, all right, where are we at here? Like, is it time to, or sorry, when I say done, L4 done, like getting the 5 for the RP and then kind of deciding. And we did a lot of watching the score, and if it ever looked scary at all, okay, switch back to L4, because we can always come back and do it later. But most of the time, that early lead felt good enough that it was pretty clear which direction the match was going.
We got scared in one of our playoff matches, like the ebb and flow, because there's diminishing returns. So you stack up L4 first, and you're like, oh, we got it, so we're gonna go do something. But then they're still stacking 4s, and you're stacking other stuff. It was it was interesting, the flow of the scores to watch.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Go ahead, Scott.
I'm curious on the comments that have been made earlier about how hard it was to score 1. Is anyone reevaluating robot design to improve their L1s? Because I'll tell you right now, it's hard for us to do an L1. It's especially since those corals are getting hung up in the middle more than we thought they would.
I think that's
Does it-
definitely something our team is starting to look at slightly. We don't know for sure like how big it is. I think we'll start off with seeing like how hard it is to do with our original design, and then depending on how that goes, we'll go from there. But for the most part, I think we're probably going to prioritize just scoring better for more point value wise, because I mean it really is only important in playoffs unless you have like coral scores that go so far on the reef.
Yeah, since we were a new team, we only had our kit bot, and I feel like it wasn't like that fancy, and like we couldn't go any more than L1. But like we also got really good at doing L1 a lot. So like as a result, there weren't many people trying to defend us because they didn't like prioritize us as a threat exactly, and so we were able just to rank up the L1, like a lot of L1 each match.
Oh yeah, there was there's this team on Lake Superior who was scoring, man, I want to say 10 or 11 in L1 every match. I can't remember which one.
Bemidji.
Bemidji, yeah. And we got in a qual with them, and they came and they said, we climb and we do that. And we're like, awesome, this is going to be 6 ranking points, no problem. And sure enough, it was. And it was interesting watching them rack up RP, despite in playoffs probably not being the perfect pick. You probably don't want someone doing 10 L1s in the playoffs, but, you know, maybe as a third bot who can climb. But it was interesting watching, just seeing those RP dynamics play out versus what you want in playoffs.
I think that, I don't know what teams have been planning for between matches. Something that came up on our board, I don't know if we'll do it or not, is whether the students want to do ground pickup. But I think if you did a simplified ground pickup that just went from the ground to L1, as hard as it's been to do L1s for those that are scoring up high, might be a viable option if you've got the weight. I don't know that we're going to have the weight to do something like that. We're right at the limit as it is. But that was something that never came up in our design meetings of going from ground to L1. But now, based on what we saw, I think that's a viable mechanism if you've got the weight to build it.
Something that I want to touch on before if we happen to move away from scoring, is an interesting dynamic change that we saw on Lake Superior side. Was last year the co-op, I think it was every match you were talking to your opposing alliance, are you going to go for the co-op or are you not going to go for the co-op? Whereas this year, I think we were only asked if we're going to try for the co-op, I think one time the entire competition. That was a big change that we saw, is that like there was not a lot of talk about your opposing alliance. Are you trying to co-op? Are you not? Like, I don't know if it was that a lot of teams weren't depending on it and they were either planning to score the algae themselves, or they were just hoping to get to 20, or it was just that they weren't worried about it at all in general. I don't know what you guys were thinking on that.
We kind of got sick of asking because it was always no. Like we'd ask every time, but the three teams would look at each other and be like, I can't do algae, I can't either, and then they all shrug and say no. So we did ask every time, but it generally was just not that many people could do algae. I mean, there's algae in the process. There's probably only, I don't know, 6 or 7 teams that could do it on Lake Superior. Somewhere in there though.
When you guys said there was no algae bots, are you talking about necessarily one that scores into the barge or into the processor, or just in general?
I think in general I feel like there wasn't a lack of bots that could knock it off the reef. For us, there wasn't any matches that was like there's algae on the reef and we can't score on L3 anymore. But those bots then could not put it in the processor or the barge. They
were all over the floor. I mean, they were a nuisance from what I was watching.
Yeah, if we could make a new robot, I think it would be really great if we could have made just one that focused only on algae, because it was really a lack of it. Like if we could just like fill that hole in the scoring process.
So I got a question here, Scott. You mentioned something that I must have missed in my game review. Are you able to score in both processor?
Yeah, you're allowed to take it to the other side of the field and put it in the opposing alliance's processor. It's not against the rules.
And do they get the point, or do you get the point?
They get the 6 points for scoring, and then your human player would get the 4 back if they can get it up into the barge.
Okay.
So it's a net 2 loss.
What is the advantage of doing that?
The co-op points are the first tiebreaker, right? Is it first
so
tiebreaker?
So
It's first tiebreaker.
if you guys are going to be doing the if you are going to co-op and they agree, and okay, that could be, I see it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what we were seeing on Northern Lights is we were getting 4 and 5 ranking points, and we were staying pace for pace with Wild Sting and Robo Huskies and Patriotics, and we were pace for pace with those on points, but we were at the bottom of the tiebreaker because we didn't have any co-op points at all. We had 0. So then we started running across the field and filling the processor for the opposing alliance so that we could improve our tiebreaker points. As long as we felt comfortable that we had enough of a lead, that was a quote unquote safe thing to do. It's sort of like double dipping, because you think, all right, I think we're gonna win this match, and now as an extra thing, let's go get more tiebreaker bonus. And eventually we were able to get ahead. We ended up getting to the point where I think our average was 0.44, and the next closest was 0.22 in the top 5. So it was a good strategy. It worked out. Like I said, it hurt our coral scoring numbers in other people's scouting data, because we were running to the other side of the field to do that. But it helped us with our rank.
We did that for one match, not for necessarily the trying to get the extra co-op point, but just to try get that lower that and that amount of coral you need to score to get that RP. We were a little slow at it, but we managed to get it, and I think we ended up getting that coral RP that match. So that was what more we saw that as a viable strategy for, was trying to actually get that cooperation to lower the amount, because nobody on our alliance could score L1, which is a common thing I think a lot of people are running into.
To play a little bit on what Aiden said earlier, I think a viable strategy for a team that can't score coral high would be to build a defense bot that could do ground pickup on LG and score in the processor, because you could put 2 in your processor, you could cross the field, put 2 in their processor, and then play defense, and that would help your alliance with the ranking point potential, as Briley said, of reducing the amount of coral that needs to be scored, but also it gets you tiebreaker points. So that's a hugely beneficial thing in claws to help your alliance. And then but you'd have to also be able to play good defense, because if you wanted to be picked up in playoffs, processor doesn't do you any good at all, really, because the RPs aren't even there. So then you'd have to shift to a pure defensive bot strategy. But I feel like if you just can't get an elevator to work, or whatever the case may be, that could be a very valuable robot, not only in calls, but potentially in playoffs then as well.
I think if we can get our robot working this week, I think by design, that's what our robot's supposed to do, is do a floor pickup algae and processor. And then the way we're building our base is to primarily be able to push other robots around, or be able to take impact. And so hopefully that works out. Hopefully we don't break anything. I mean, we have a coral, intake, but hopefully we don't depend on using that, because based on what I've seen, is algae needs to be taking it off the reef is one thing. Getting it off the floor is what I didn't see this weekend.
I would like to talk about, we talked about the algae human player and how it's not very difficult to score up in the barge, but what were your guys' thoughts on your coral human players, whether it was your own trying to feed in, or if defense is being played on you, how good were your alliance partners at also being able to feed your robots? Like, were they cooperative? Most of our teammates were pretty good at being able to feed us. We have a pretty simple intake, but there were a few matches where we discussed how we wanted to be fed, and then we got to a match, and they were either really slow at feeding us or tried to feed us the wrong way. And I just kind of want to see what your guys' thoughts on that were.
Yeah, our human player was pretty good. They did it fast and put it flat the way we wanted it, so I can't say much there.
We were worried about ours. We had one of the internal coral intakes, and we were terrified that was going to hang us all up, but we were very happy, and it seemed like it was pretty intuitive, and it worked out for the most part.
I think during playoffs for us, I think it was part human player skill and part of our design. Halfway through, so the first half we had our human players switch sides. So then our player would feed our robot during auto and then switch to our side for the driver station. But then, like after a couple matches in, we decided not to because defense was getting played and we were forced to cross the other station, and their feeding techniques were pretty much the same. Also, like something I noticed with when we played against Hilltoppers was that their intake was not forgiving to other teams' human players. During our second qualification match, we had one of our robots play defense on them, and like looking back at the match, they had to like switch coral stations onto a different team's human player, and it took them a few seconds to figure out how to feed it properly to the Hilltoppers robot.
Did you see them? I didn't know the human players could sprint side to side. So there was a couple matches where their human player was like running side to side wherever the defense was. I thought that was interesting.
Our
Yeah.
human player did that too. They switched a couple of times. I don't know that was a great strategy, but we did see that happen a couple of matches where our human player, they must have prearranged that they were going to swap or something because they both ran to the other side and they swapped. Our human player also, a tip for anyone who hasn't played yet, our human player was getting his hands cut on the reef. So we had to run to the hardware store and get him some gloves. So take gloves for your human player. We alerted the FTA. They did some things to the loading station. Maybe they'll do more things to it when they set up the field for week 2. But I would recommend having your human players wear gloves. Our human player also would we had to feed ours vertically. So he would put the coral in and then he would grab it from on top so that he could slide it back and forth. And that seemed to work well for feeding quickly. It was a good strategy. But anyway, wear gloves. Have your human players wear some gloves so don't cut their hands.
Jeremy has his hand up.
I was just going to mention that we were partnered with a few different teams that only had one driver, and then their operator was technically a second human player who would be at a coral station, and then they might have their other human player at the processor or something like that. There were teams who did that. We have too many buttons. There's no way we could split up our driver and operator personally, but there were teams who did make that decision and had multiple human players. Just wanted to put that out there too.
I was gonna throw in too that match against Hilltoppers that Sam mentioned. Even before the match, we had talked with our robot. It was Fire Bears who was going to play defense, and we actually said it's more important to hunt down their human player and block their human player than their robot to make sure that, or like basically, if you saw their human player cut over, follow that, and kind of keep an eye on that. And that seemed to work pretty well. Of course, in playoffs, it was interesting to see. Right after line selection, how many teams went over to the practice field and started first thing they did, start feeding each other's robots. That's what we did anyway. Just getting used to it because we knew crossing over was going to happen. And in playoffs, it got to the point where we didn't care who we were feeding from. We had no preference on human player. Both were good enough that we couldn't tell the difference. I think that's really important. It really slows down defense if you can load from anywhere. They shut down one station, you can cross over.
It's probably worth putting on the match planning list to have human players discuss with each other.
I was interested.
Yeah, we actually oftentimes we had their human player come over to our pit and see our robot and be like, all right, here's the spot you need to aim for in our funnel so that you always get it in and it never jams up. And so that we found that to be really helpful, having the human player come to our pit and see the robot.
I was interested in what Scott was talking about. I saw a couple of teams that also were reaching through the horizontal slot to hold their game piece. And I thought the refs were going to kind of shut that down because usually they don't let you to reach into the scoring mechanism. Like for the notes last year, that was a big no-no. But I never saw that get shut down. I saw teams doing that all the way to the end. So that is definitely a viable thing. And it allows you to slide that coral really easily So if you're getting defense play on you, you can really move that coral and get it in the right spot. That's definitely a good strategy to talk with your human player about.
We talked to the refs or the FTA or somebody at the beginning, and that so you've got the first plane that's got the holes in it, and then you've got the second plane which is intended to put the thing in horizontally. As long as your hand never breaks that second plane, you're fine. So you definitely have to hold the back of the coral. If you push your fingers underneath that second plane, then you're in violation. But as long as you stay back and you grab the end of that coral.
I think it's their hands.
What do you mean the hands?
I don't know. I mean,
yeah, your hand can't break the second plane.
On at least the Lake Superior side, I saw that's how Thunder. That's the only way they fed that. Their hand was fully on the bottom, like down between that plane, and they would feed it in like that. I think I saw that the whole comp. They were doing that, and they never got no note on that. It definitely looked a little bit scary sometimes, but I don't think anybody called that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, again, a second hand, so I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that you've got the first vertical plane that has the holes in it, and then you've got the second vertical plane that is kind of the backstop for if you want to put your thing in horizontally. As long as your hand doesn't break that second vertical plane, I believe that's supposed to be okay. Julia, are you understanding something different though? Did you get told something different?
I wasn't told anything different. I just saw that I saw at least 2 teams that were breaking that rule and never got called on breaking that rule, at least mid-match. So that was something I saw.
Yeah, we asked that same question at the beginning of like on Wednesday or Thursday for drivers meeting, and they told us the same thing. And what we've kind of seen too is that the calls were inconsistent. Like from our human player, like he said, like at the beginning, like they would catch him every now and then, but a lot of the time it would kind of go under the radar. Like as long as it clearly wasn't going past it, I guess like if his like fingers like crossed that breach, I think they wouldn't see it.
Julia, I don't want to shut you down. Is that what you were saying, or were you saying something different? Okay. I see she said, nope, sorry about that in the chat. Well, if you've got more to add, please. I didn't mean to shut you down if that's how it came across, but if you've got more to add, please do.
I feel like if you were going to feed it vertically, it was almost easier to be a little overzealous putting your hand through the hole and then extending your arm too far down that slot. Whereas if you had your arm and your fingers, let's say, holding onto the top of the back of the coral, and you push it, your knuckles would hit that wall and you'd let go. And I think it was, harder that way to get your hand down that slot when you're already kind of got it crooked around. So the coral length was almost the same length as the chute past that second wall. And so I think one thing they were looking at too is if they saw that the coral hadn't been released yet from your hand, but it was sticking out past into the field, that your hand must be still in contact with it and therefore extended past that plane as well.
Yeah, I think it's something that it's an advantage to stick your hand down the chute, and it's hard for the refs to see. I think it's going to be something where teams are riding the line all season, and it's going to be a thing that keeps coming up of, check out this video. They're clearly sticking their hand down and no one called it. And I think there's going to be a lot of that because it's a big advantage and you can really fire it down that if you push further. So it'll be interesting to see that as the season progresses.
But I think we see that all the time. For Power Up, we saw people whipping those cones all the way to midfield, and there clearly was no way to do that unless your hand was inside the field. I think this happens a lot. So I'm not surprised that some teams were pushing the limits and not getting called.
Someone talked in the chat about talking about line selection. Before we go there, we're talking about obviously reaching your hand. That's a foul that was kind of getting rode on the line. Are there any other fouls people saw that they maybe thought should have been fouls, but were kind of getting brushed off or only were getting called sometimes? I don't think there was any that we saw, but maybe someone saw some of those.
One foul that we identified, unfortunately, was if you're scoring in the barge, it's fine to touch the metal pole, but you cannot touch the fabric mesh. Because one time when we were coming down from scoring in the barge, our wheels sort of hit that net, and we got a foul play called on us. So that's something to keep in mind if you are scoring into the barge, that we've figured out that we extend up, go over a couple inches, shoot the algae, score, go back a couple inches, and then retract, just to avoid hitting that mesh. But something to keep in mind that we didn't realize before the competition.
It was kind of nice to not be thinking about how the game was called, honestly. Like, it just felt good. Like, a match is over and you're like, yep, that's what happened.
Yeah, I think the pinning calls, like Dominic had said earlier, it seemed like that maybe was changing a little bit as the day went on. But otherwise, I agree. I think it was pretty straightforward for most things.
I thought I was glad to see, I think, how generous they were on the climbs, where if someone was kind of rocking a little bit and maybe tapping, they would rock and maybe one would tap for half a second and then come back up. They pretty much were getting credit for it. Versus like where they kind of, unless they actually settled on the ground, it seemed like they were pretty much defaulting to, you got credit for the climb.
Alrighty. So, how do you guys feel about the alliance selection? I felt watching from being the pick area for the alliance captains, I thought it went really quickly. I thought that was a nice part about that. I don't know what you guys about alliance captains that were on the field. How did you guys feel pressured with the 2-minute pick time, or do you feel like you had plenty of time to pick?
I know for us, like, especially for our second pick, thinking about you want to have a list of 2 or 3 teams, just so in case your top team gets picked, you don't have to scramble to find your next pick within a minute 30. I know that was helpful for us. We fortunately didn't have to use that, go down the list at all, but thinking about how, rather than just having one pick in mind, having a couple, and ranking those picks just in case. I know that was a big thing for us, but I don't think Northern Lights had any issues with the timer. I mean, I wasn't watching it, but that was interesting.
Dominic, didn't your alliance make their second pick with like 6 seconds left on the clock? I thought that was Alliance 4. Was it Alliance 3? Somebody on Northern Lights just barely beat the buzzer on their second pick.
It must have been Alliance 3. We were fine.
All right. But nobody got skipped. Did anybody get skipped on the Lake Superior side?
No, it seemed pretty fine for Lake Superior. I think the only problem was when Thunder Robotics was picking like the top 3 alliances, and we all said no. And then I think they were like a little frazzled, and then they picked Hexhounds though, and then from there, like everybody pretty much knew who they were picking, and there wasn't long hesitations.
I think the longest hesitation was, I think it was Alliance 4's second pick. I think was the longest wait, where they got down to like 15 or 20 seconds. But other than that, yeah, it was just Thunder's asking for the top 3 captains and all getting rejected. But other than that, yeah, no one was skipped, and it felt smooth and it felt quick.
That felt really good. And the people in the audience too, like that have been through some of the ones that take forever, like it was refreshing for them. They're like, oh, that was really nice and fast this year, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I think thinking about the other part that was changed, having the 3 people on the field, the before alliance selection, it was definitely crowded in the queuing area. I know last year it was already getting crowded, just having 60 people in the queuing area, and having triple that number definitely did not help. And so that was surprising to me, that it got pretty crowded on before alliance selection even started. But I think having the 3 people was interesting. I think it helped a lot. I know, like for us, we had me and the person I was training in to be our next strategist, and then we had one of our pit scouts actually, which was interesting, just to be able to identify, all right, I saw this robot, what does it look like? You know, we were scouting robustness and like general strategy, and so being able to say, all right, for a defense pick, yes, we know that robot shouldn't break during playoffs, which I thought was really interesting. But we had 3 students. I think the other teams on our the other 2 teams on our alliance also only had didn't have any mentors on them. I don't know exactly the ratio. It would be interesting to see whether teams had 2 students and a mentor or 3 students. I wasn't keeping an eye out.
I will say that we had an adult on the field. They asked him if he would be on the field, and he said, well, only if you don't have another student who's a better choice. And they said, no, we want you on the field. So that was a student choice, but we did have an adult on the field, our drive coach. I also wasn't keeping track of how many adults. I would just a rough guess, maybe 50-50, maybe 30-70. I wasn't quite keeping track of that kind of thing.
I don't think it was too crowded. Speaking on what Dominic said, that was just my thought, at least on the Lake Superior side. I felt like we had plenty of space. And the same for the mentor count. I would agree with Scott. I think it was around that 30, maybe 40, 60. There was definitely more students than mentors. But I do kind of like that fact that allows for more discussion between your team and it skips out on that phone call. You have more brains thinking together rather than putting all that pressure on one person. And I did like that thought process of it.
I know at least like our alliance, we still did have a phone call. We had a voice chat going on with people in the stands, which I thought was interesting, and I was not necessarily expecting. I don't know whether other teams still chose to use that phone call or not. That was interesting. I also know that we just we didn't have a phone call, but then we said, all right, here are our picks, and we typed them out in Slack and said, do these look good? But yeah, I thought that was interesting thinking about what if it disincentivized phone calls, but they still happened.
It is nice to have a team of people down there. We had a kid a couple years ago that recopied the list wrong, and that hurt and was really embarrassing. So if you have a few people, like, it's just nice because you're a part of a team.
Well, we're getting to the end. Does anybody have anything that we maybe haven't already talked about and they'd like to touch up on?
Ooh, I have a question.
Go for it.
So, we're pretty new team, so we're still getting our bearings of how this all works. I was just wondering, like, what kind of advice would you give a brand new team that doesn't have any experience with FRC robotics until now?
I can give a little bit of just feedback in general. When we played with you, it was one of the most fun matches we had. That match 58 was so fun to play with y'all. It was so fun seeing like all of the passion and energy that you all had. And our drive coach was like, that was incredible. So definitely keep that up. That was super fun to see.
Yeah, I agree. That was such a fun match.
Aiden, what team are you on?
3054. It's a team of like 6 people from Grand Marais.
So I'm on a team of 4 people. We
Really?
are not a new team. I think we've been around for about 12 years now. So being a small team is definitely hard. I'd say everybody's got to be able to pitch in and kind of help out. You don't have the liberty to have a programming team and a build team, kind of that thing. But everybody has their own disciplines, can help out in that way. I think a good thing to do is being at comp, go out and look at as many robots as you can, see how people are doing things, see how they're doing their electronics, how they're coming up with ideas is definitely a big thing to do.
Sure.
Coming from not a smaller team, like my lead build kid and the kid with him now, a newer girl who joined our team this year. So total, I think like Bradley said, we have 6 kids on my team consistently. We had illness broke out this past week. Myself, 2 of the kids, and that pretty much has hurt our productivity. And sometimes it helps to know that you can have all hands on deck. But the one thing I would advise is what we don't have on our team is a residential programmer. None of my kids, they try to get into it and they hit the rock bottom. Like, nope, I'm done. This is not my thing. And so if you can get a kid on your team that can be a programmer, I think that would be a huge advantage for a small team because right now that's what's really hurts us is that we don't have that. And I'm constantly outsourcing from Scott or another programmer, programming mentor from a different team because I'm not a programmer. That's not my thing.
Yeah.
And I want to, but I got a life that I can't even live. So anyway, but just if anyone can program on your team, that's great. And don't underestimate your size too, because sometimes that's a strength too, because you're not crawling on top of each other too. Just ask yourself, ask your team, what do you want in this program? What do you want to get out of it? How much do you put in is what you're going to get out of it. And what I've learned is that even with my fewer kids, sometimes it's easier to manage them than when you have 15, 20, 30 kids, because then it's like, whoa, okay, now if depending on how many mentors you have on your team too, that becomes cumbersome too to work with that many people too. And then people start kind of getting on each other's skin too. So that's something else too. So work out your team culture, your team dynamics, that's also very important too. How they communicate with each other and in those things too, that it helps a whole lot when they're laughing and working, and being goofy in the hotel or in the pit and all that stuff brings out good, morale for a small team too.
I think Jeremy raised his hands first, and then so Jeremy, you want to give your say on it?
I'd put it in the chat, but just try not cost yourself, a match or anything like that. We were rushing and we just had mental errors as a team, not any individual ones. It was a group effort that cost us. We know we have a good robot, but we just couldn't make it happen this weekend. So double check things that you think you shouldn't double check would just be my advice.
Yeah, we had, that totally makes sense because one round we had put a bad battery in our robot and we didn't know, and it was just dead.
Literally, it's embarrassing to admit, but we sort of had the same situation. We had a bad battery charger and we just weren't checking it. So I hear you.
Yeah, I think every team gets at least one round where they don't move for whatever reason.
Not every team. You're talking to some very good teams here in Minnesota who made that. I hear you. I know what you're talking about, but not having that happen automatically makes you in the top 50% or even 25%. If you move every single match, you're automatically in the top 30%. So I'm agreeing with you, Aiden. Completely.
Yeah.
We finally made the switch to have separate build and drive team, and it's hard because we're small. But our experienced kids quit driving and said, we need to just maintain the robot. And we put some younger kids driving that had skills. And we had such better performance. Like, we had no issues. We had one issue where the robot slowed down at the end because a screw started rubbing. But, we fixed it. And, I highly recommend that. I mean, I know everyone says it, but it was hard to do, but it is huge.
Do you have something to add, David?
Yeah, one of the things that I would highly suggest is get to know the teams in your area. If you have a hub or an arc or anything like that, get to know them. And when you're at competition, send what students you have that are available into the pits and have them take pictures of cool things they see on robots, different manipulators, different intakes, whatever, and then talk to the students that built it and figure out how they did it. And then the last thing is on the whole loose wires and everything, we have a post-match checklist that we go through every match. And it is to check all the wires, shaft collars, hubs, and all of that stuff. And then we do an ops check before we go back out to make sure everything is working. Does it always work? No. We lost Can in a match. Because you can check all the wires you want, but when you take a hard hit, sometimes a wire comes loose. But that has helped us tremendously in cutting down on a lot of those little mistakes. So I highly suggest coming up with a post-match checklist, to go through and check all of that stuff. And then once you're done checking it, make sure it all works.
All right.
Scott, you got something on that?
In addition to those two things that David just said, post-match, pre-match, make a list, tape it to your robot, put your robot on the field. Is it facing the right way? Did you put a game piece in the robot? Did you turn it on? Those are all mistakes we've made in the past, and you write it on the list of things that you need to do when you put your robot on the field. The other thing I'll say in terms of what do you do next year, if you want to do swerve, buy your swerve and do it over the summer or do it in the fall. Do not wait till January to put your first swerve module together. And if there are other things that you want to learn how to do, if you want to learn how to do pneumatics, if you want to learn how to make a 4-bar mechanism, if you want to do an elevator, buy those things now, put one together, learn what you're going to fail at before it's January. Anything that you can do in the off season, so either in the fall or if you meet over the summer, do the hard things that you want to do early. And then the other thing is don't design outside your team's capability. If you don't own a CNC or a water jet or a laser or any of those things, there are a ton of things that you can do with off the shelf parts. Like West Coast Products, I think, has a competitive bot concept. Every single part on that robot is you can just buy it and it'll be shipped to you. You don't have to cut anything in your shop or anything like that. So make sure that you're building within your team's abilities, and then work on extending your abilities in the off season. That's my piece of advice.
Yeah, I like what Scott was saying. Since we're a small team, we like to wait usually after the first week and look at all the robot in 3 days. That really helps with inspiration, since we don't have a team of 7 people to come think of ideas and then prototype them. It's like, here's a bunch of good ideas that we can just look at and then take them and make them our own design. Jeremiah, you raised your hand.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott, for saying that, actually, because that's some of the things we've done. I think my team is it about being competitive, or is it about just being innovative? Like, you want to challenge yourself to build a robot that's like challenges your skills, and then, okay, what did you see? What mechanism did you see this season that we haven't done before? And now let's go in the summer, because in the summer we meet at least one Saturday in the summer, and then in the fall every other Saturday, and then and so then let's work on those things. Does it mean they work out flawlessly? No, but we're never gonna try something. We learned now 2 years ago. Don't try something new that you haven't done before. just walk into this game. And the other thing is your battery. Your battery. Take a zip tie and zip tie that connection together too. Hot glue, Ethernet ports, hot glue that stuff together. One thing we also learned from our off season this year with NMRC is no ferrules. We had to wiggle, straight into the port, because with the ferrules, if you don't have the right gauge and the right crimper, that wire, one little push on that robot and that wire just disconnecting. Now you're sitting doing nothing, and all that is because one little wire came undone,
Yeah.
So, I gotta go get there.
Hand raised.
Was that me?
Yep.
Some of our favorite games have been when we didn't try to compete with what we knew the top robots would do. So like this year, everyone was talking about algae and the different ways algae could be super useful in Alliance. And sometimes it's really good if you find something that seems like it'd be a really fun way to play and it would be a great support robot. Doing that is easier than trying to compete with really experienced teams, and you'll have an amazing tournament. And I think I heard you say Grand Marais?
Yeah.
Okay, so Dave was just talking about the ARC, and you're kind of off in nowhere, but I'm also northeastern Minnesota, so there are teams. If you can get to one of those practice field days, do that, because there are people nearby that can help, and we're close if you need it. So,
gotcha.
Show up to one
Practice field will be at Marshall High School in Duluth this coming weekend. and it will be at Denfeld High School the next weekend after that. So if you want to come down to Duluth for Saturday, the field will be open. I don't know if you guys have another competition coming up, or if you just want to come down and meet some of the teams in the area. I know Hermantown, Esco, Marshall, us, probably Iron Mosquitoes. We'll be down there, and just to make those connections and check out our robots. Bring your robot down. We can, you can practice. You can run on the field. We'll have a whole lot of fun.
Cool. Yeah. Sweet. Well, thanks. That's helpful. Really helpful.
And that's open for any team that's in the area. If you are looking to come practice, it'll be at Marshall High School in Duluth and at Denfeld High School the weekend after. So come on up, hang out. We'll have fun.
All right.
All right, we're at 8:30. Does anyone have any final thoughts? Looks like people are saying their goodbyes in the chat. All right, big round of applause for Briley. Excellent job. Thank you so much for doing this, Briley. I'm glad I didn't have to lead this discussion. It's always nice when someone else steps up to do that. Next week, we have battery conditioning. Shoot, I should have brought up the thing beforehand. I can't remember who's doing battery conditioning, but we're going to do our battery management maintenance.
That's me.
All right, Dr. B is going to do it. Excellent. Thank you for popping in. You want to give us a preview?
It will not take the whole time, but honestly, we've got a couple students talking about how we do our battery management, what we've done wrong and what we've done right. We've actually had like 6 years of progress where we went from nothing to probably doing okay with battery management. So that won't take the whole time, but trying to get your robot in the field without a dead battery is the whole deal. And then getting the power from the battery to the robot is the second thing. So we'll talk about that.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great. And I have a feeling maybe that'll lead into a whole lot of questions about how people are managing their wiring and stuff.
Yeah, there'll be all kinds of arguments about which gauge wire to use and which connectors to use and all that other stuff. We'll talk about that next week. We'll start with basics and then we'll argue about what everybody's doing. It'll be great.
I will say that the last time we had a talk focused on wiring, we got into a really heated
It'll be
debate
heated.
about,
It'll be heated. 2 versus 4 versus 6 versus whatever. I know. Yeah.
So stay tuned. Come back. It'll be a good one. And then after that, I don't think we have anything else on the schedule. So if anyone here wants to do another talk, whatever it is, and plus I'd love to have some more get to know my team talks. So if you want to give sort of a summary, a presentation of how you recruit, how you pick your captains or leaders, every team does something different. It'd be great to if a team wants to step up and do that. So far, we've only had 2. Mythic and Gears. So if anyone wants to give that talk, March is mostly wide open, and then beyond that as well. So please do that. Thanks again to the students. You guys did a great job tonight. All the students that participated tonight, you guys gave great feedback. It's nice to have the mentors and the students going toe to toe on how much content is being shared. That's great. We don't want to have the mentors hogging all the conversation every week. So thank you to the students. We really appreciate it. All right. Thank you again, Briley. I hope everyone has a good week after competition. And for those that are competing in the coming weeks, best of luck to you. Hope you got some value out of tonight's call. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bro.